Okay, so I was asked a question about selecting colors for base coats on one of these videos, and so this section of Notes for the New Gamer is going to be about color selection and base coat selection and kind of the ideology that goes behind that. I've got a few work in progress miniatures in front of me here to help demonstrate that point, and I also have a color wheel behind us. Now, a couple of notes on the color wheel. You can see that you've got color is basically broken down into three axes. So you've got one axis which is black to white, then you've got blue to yellow, and then finally red to green. And that's the way color works. Color is plotted along those three axes, so any color that you pick will have quote-unquote coordinate along those three axes. And that becomes important when you're talking about complementary colors. So as you can see here on the color wheel, your complementary colors are typically across the axes, and then you may pick a secondary color on one of the adjacent axes. So for example here, yellow complementary color is going to be a blue, and then you may have a violet, or maybe a violet, a red, or a green as your other colors. So that's one way to look at selecting these colors. That's not really what I'd like to talk about in this video. Really want to talk about some of the consequences and some of the workarounds as far as selecting your colors. Now, I like to choose pretty bright colors, as you can see from the miniatures. I like to work with blues, whites. I like to work with violet a little bit as well, so you can see that on my miniature. Now, there are some problems with working with these really intense colors. Typically, when you're talking about color schemes, there are going to be earthy color schemes here, like browns, some of the medium browns, some grays. Those are some of the muted colors. Now, muted colors are great because for one, they tend to hide very well. They also have a nice balance between the pigment, the water, and the resin itself. So those colors, like the softer browns, beiges, grays, those tend to apply very well. They tend to hide very well, and they tend to flatten down quite nicely. Conversely, when you start talking about more intense colors, like your bright yellow, or maybe a very intense red, those colors do not hide very well, and that's because those colors tend to start in clear bases. In other words, the paint manufacturer will make different bases depending on the color that paint is supposed to accept. So in the case of like a very bright blue, like for example GW Reaper Blue, or maybe even another intense red like a red gore or blood red, those colors tend to hide very poorly because they have to start off in a more clear base. They've got less pigment, less TiO2 in them. They don't start with white, is what I'm saying. So when you're working with base coating, one thing that you can do if you want to try to get hide really quickly is work with a more muted color. Work with a dirtier color than what you're going to end up with. So for example, if I'm trying to get to this red out here, I want to start with almost a brown color, a reddish brown color, because that's going to that'll give me good hide, and then I can highlight my way back up to the intense red that I want. And you use this principle with regards to painting all of your different colors as well. So so again, your bright red's not going to hide very well. You start with a very kind of a muted brownish color, and you work your way out. For white, like what I have on Colette here, white is interesting because white, no matter how much you paint it, it's going to show some of the underlying layers, and you can use that to your advantage depending on the type of white you're trying to get. So for example here, I've got a little Teddy miniature down here, and he's got kind of a whitish belly. Let me see if I can get that on camera. Okay. So he kind of has a whitish belly, and then he's got teeth and fangs and claws. And so you want a white as your endpoint, but you want a more organic tone to it. You want it to look a little more realistic, or yeah, I guess the term is going to be organic there. So you're going to start off with browns, your beiges, yellows as your base coat, and work your way up to white. Now this white, which is the endpoint of the belly, and the white on Colette are the same white. The difference is where I started. So with Colette, I started with more of a gray, and then added white, and highlighted my way back up until the point where I was working with only white on the highest parts of the model. Now, white is particularly challenging for new painters in particular, because formulaically white has some properties to it that aren't great for painting. White is almost entirely pigment, for example. Flat white is. And pigment is very dry, very coarse. And depending on how the paint manufacturer grinds their pigment, how finely they grind their pigment, could end up affecting the flatness and smoothness of the paint as you apply it to the model. It also means that white tends to dry a little faster than other paints. So you have to be particularly careful when you're painting white. You're going to want to thin it quite a bit. You're going to want to use a lot of layers. So very thin, multiple layers just to get back to white. And for example, on Colette here, I started with gray, went all the way back up to white. But believe it or not, there's still quite a bit of gray showing on that model. The model is deceptively white. It's not actually as white as it could be. And that has to do with the transparency of the layers. And so I use some tricks to try to make that white pop a little bit more. One thing I do is I use a complementary color like blue. Now blues, grays, blacks contrast very sharply with white. They lead to a much cleaner looking white as your endpoint. So if you're going for a very clean white, those are the colors that you would start with and complement with. For a more organic white, you're going to start with more yellows, more browns, and you may shade with yellows and browns as well. So that would be white. Again, white probably being a little bit more tedious than some of the other colors you might work with. Black is the opposite. For black, you want to start with black, and then really you just want to highlight it. Depending on how clean of a black you want, you would go towards blues, really dark blues, maybe even violets to get at a clean black, whereas a dirtier black you might highlight with a little bit more towards the brown side. So those are a couple of tricks on the opposite ends of the spectrum. For colors like grays and browns, those come a little bit easier as far as painting is concerned. You can highlight them and mix them into whatever shade you want, and you're going to get good hiding from top to bottom with those. There are a couple of exceptions though, and that's where you start getting into really vibrant colors. Now I know miniature painters, when you want your minis to pop, you are going to want to use those intense colors. And for advanced painters, that's really not a problem. They're used to painting multiple layers of paint. For a new painter, you probably want to practice a little bit before you start getting into the more vibrant color schemes. Now, in a previous video, I talked about P3 paints and how well they hide, and I think they're very good paints. But my criticism about P3 paints was they were a little muted. In other words, their colors weren't quite as clean as some of the colors I wanted to get to. And I'll use the example of Signar Yellow. Now, Signar Yellow is a very good color to use for yellow as base coats or as a main coat. The Signar Yellow, though, is not quite the cleanest yellow on the block. So, you know, if I were to just kind of as an example here, let's just say Signar yellow is out here. Then you might have some of your brighter yellows, some of the GW yellows in particular are out here where they're a little more intense. Obviously the trade-off with the GW yellows is they're not going to hide as well. And again, with yellow being a very high pigment load, you have to be careful about the grind size that they're using on some of those yellows. I know from painting quite a bit of yellow, I use yellow quite a bit in my Eldar army, that your choice of yellow is going to be pretty critical, and it's the same MO with white. You really want to thin yellow quite a bit and apply as many layers as you can tolerate. Thin layers, obviously. So really, that's it for this section. I hope I managed to answer a question or two. If you do have specific questions, go ahead and put one down in the comment section, and thanks for watching.